Russell Crowe had been watching this relationship from a position most people never had, not as an outsider, not through headlines, but from close enough to notice what didn't match the surface. From the outside, everything eventually looked stable: a long-term marriage, successful careers, and an image that rarely showed cracks. But Crowe wasn't focused on what was visible, he was focused on what didn't quite add up. And over time, those small inconsistencies began forming a pattern that didn't fully align with the story everyone believed. And this is where things start to become important, because what he noticed wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, and that's exactly why it went unnoticed for so long. What makes this even more interesting is that none of those early signs looked serious at the time. In fact, they looked completely normal. Small moments, brief interactions, decisions that didn't seem important when they happened. But this is where most people misread situations like this, because when those same patterns repeat over time, they stop being random. They start becoming structure. And according to what Crowe had been observing from the very beginning, that structure was slowly shifting in a direction most people couldn't see yet. And that's not even the surprising part, because those signs didn't appear later, they were already present at the start. To understand what he saw, you have to go back to early 2005, a moment that seemed insignificant at the time but carried more weight than anyone realized. At a high-profile event in Los Angeles, the environment was exactly what you'd expect: media attention, industry figures, and carefully managed appearances. Nicole Kidman was already one of the most recognized figures in the world, but internally she was still in a rebuilding phase after her previous marriage. She appeared composed, but there was still a level of emotional vulnerability beneath that surface that most people couldn't see. And this is where the first key detail appears, because when someone is in that state, the type of connection they respond to becomes very specific. Then Keith Urban entered the room. At that point, he wasn't yet the global figure he would later become, but he carried a presence that stood out in a quieter way. What happened next wasn't dramatic, there was no public moment, no visible interaction that cameras could capture. But there was a brief exchange of attention, just enough to create an impression. Nicole later admitted she felt immediate attraction, a strong initial pull that started forming emotional investment almost instantly. But here's where things stop making sense: nothing followed that moment. No conversation, no follow-up, no continuation. And that silence didn't last days, it lasted months. This is where the psychology becomes critical, because when a strong first impression is followed by uncertainty, it doesn't weaken attraction, it intensifies it. The lack of clarity creates space for interpretation, and that interpretation builds emotional weight over time. Nicole was left waiting, questioning whether that moment meant anything, and that uncertainty added depth instead of reducing it. And this is one of the first patterns Crowe would have recognized, because relationships that begin with imbalance often carry that imbalance forward. Months later, contact finally happened. And from that point forward, everything accelerated. The connection developed quickly, almost intensely. Time spent together felt meaningful, decisions happened faster than expected, and Nicole later described that phase as the moment she became certain. That level of certainty, formed in a short period, shows how strong that emotional connection felt. But here's the detail most people overlook: fast certainty doesn't always mean stable certainty, and that difference becomes important later. By mid-2006, they were married. The wedding itself reinforced the narrative that had already formed: everything looked aligned, everything made sense visually, and the relationship appeared solid from every angle. They created habits that strengthened that image: writing letters to each other when apart, maintaining emotional connection despite distance. On the surface, it looked like one of the strongest foundations in modern celebrity relationships. But Crowe wasn't just observing the surface, he was watching the structure underneath. And what he noticed didn't fully match what everyone else was seeing. Because even at that stage, there were unresolved factors. Keith Urban was still dealing with personal struggles that hadn't fully stabilized. Nicole was fully invested, fully committed, but the foundation they were building on wasn't as stable as it appeared. And this is where the second major pattern begins, because when one person is stabilizing while the other is still fluctuating, the roles become defined early. And once those roles are set, they rarely change. Only a few months into the marriage, that pattern was tested. In late 2006, the situation escalated quickly. What should have been the most stable phase of a new relationship turned into immediate pressure. Nicole responded by restructuring everything, stepping away from her career, shifting her focus entirely, and supporting Keith through recovery. She became the stabilizing force, the one maintaining structure while everything else was unstable. And from the outside, this looked like strength, commitment, proof that the relationship could survive anything. But internally, it created imbalance. One person providing stability, the other relying on it. And this is where things quietly begin to change, because patterns like this don't disappear once the crisis is over, they become the way the relationship functions. Even when things improve, the structure often stays the same. And over time, that creates pressure that isn't immediately visible. For years after that, everything appeared stable. They built a family, maintained a strong public image, and became known as a relationship that had overcome early challenges. But here's what most people don't understand: long-term relationships are rarely affected by one major event. They're shaped by repeated conditions that slowly change how everything works. And in this case, one of the biggest conditions was distance. Keith Urban's career required constant touring, often keeping him away for more than half the year. That level of absence doesn't just affect physical presence, it changes communication, connection, and shared experience. At the same time, Nicole's career kept her in completely different environments. And this is where another shift begins, because when two people operate in different worlds for long periods, connection starts depending entirely on communication. And when communication changes, everything changes. At first, this kind of structure can work. With enough effort, alignment, and trust, distance can be managed. But over time, it starts to alter the relationship. Conversations become more functional, less emotional. Shared experiences decrease. And connection becomes something that requires effort instead of happening naturally. And this shift doesn't happen suddenly, it builds gradually, almost invisibly. And that's not even the main issue, because as distance increases, something else starts to change. Clarity. Communication began showing subtle inconsistencies, not obvious enough to create conflict immediately, but noticeable enough to change behavior. And this is where the next pattern appears. Nicole began making unexpected visits to Keith's tour locations. On the surface, it looked supportive, even romantic. But in reality, it suggested something deeper. Because when clarity decreases, people don't just trust, they verify. And once that shift happens, the relationship changes permanently. Around 2018, everything reached another turning point. Nicole, already under emotional pressure from demanding work, noticed something that didn't align. Messages on Keith's phone, not casual, not insignificant, but detailed enough to raise questions. And this is where uncertainty turned into confirmation. Not a public moment, but a private realization that changed how everything was understood moving forward. The situation was addressed, conversations happened, attempts were made to rebuild trust. From the outside, it looked like recovery again. But here's the reality: once trust is broken, it doesn't return to its original form. It becomes conditional, and maintaining it requires constant effort. And over time, that effort becomes pressure. If you're starting to connect these patterns, how early imbalance, distance, and repeated behavior all link together, then you're already seeing what most people miss. And that's exactly why breakdowns like this matter, because they reveal how things actually develop beneath the surface. If you want to keep understanding these patterns at a deeper level, subscribe to the channel, because the next part explains why this outcome was almost inevitable. By the time things reached the later stages, the structure had already changed. The earlier patterns hadn't disappeared, they had repeated. The imbalance, the distance, the trust issues, all of it had accumulated. And this is where the final phase begins, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual separation. Less shared time, less alignment, more independence. By 2025, the separation became visible. Public appearances decreased, routines separated, and the connection that once looked stable started showing clear signs of disconnection. And when that process completes, the outcome becomes unavoidable. Then came the final step. The official separation. And this is where the numbers finally appeared. Nicole with 306 days of custody. Keith with 59, roughly 17% of the year. That number isn't random, it reflects how things were already functioning before the legal process began. It wasn't just an outcome, it was a reflection of long-term patterns. Financially, everything was handled cleanly, no ongoing ties, no extended obligations, a complete separation. From Crowe's perspective, this wasn't about one mistake. It wasn't about one moment. It was about patterns that repeated over time, roles that never fully changed, and a structure that slowly shifted until it couldn't hold anymore. And when you look at it like that, the outcome doesn't feel surprising. It feels consistent. Now in 2026, the situation has moved into its final phase. Russell Crowe continues to support Nicole closely, maintaining a connection that has existed for decades. That support has even started creating pressure in his own personal life, showing how deeply he remains involved. Keith Urban, on the other hand, is left facing the result of everything that built over time, not one decision, not one mistake, but a sequence of patterns that led here. And that's the key takeaway. Because in situations like this, it's never the moment that ends things, it's everything that builds quietly before it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand what's really happening behind stories like this.